Going back, I mean, having communicated with it, is it the right goal or is it the right vision that we have for the change? And then when we hit rocky ground, if you will, or troubled seas, choppy waters, whatever analogy you want to use, are we prepared to sustain the change through that? That's the big challenge, and I think that's where it fails, really, the lack of ability to sustain it.
I think.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, if I could just make the point. I mean, there's a whole industry in change management, isn't there, between master's programs and gurus all around the world. But one of the things that probably makes it difficult is that there's a very good saying about change: organizations don't change, people do. Right. So it means at the end of the day, it's people who have to change, and it's a fundamental psychological thing that you can't do change to people. In other words, you can't make me change. So you can come back to all the academic learning you like, but a lot of the managing change comes around to more being an art and a task of a challenge of leadership and of ability to manage interpersonal relationships. Yeah. And I think to observe certain essentials that are there. But if you take it, I mean, some of the simple research, if you take New Year's resolutions, we all make New Year's resolutions. The research says that about 90% of them fail. Now, it may not be exactly applicable to a business environment, but one of the things in New Year's resolutions is we're saying, I actually want to change. I really need to give up cigarettes, or I need to get fitter. Yeah. And 3 to 4 weeks later, going back to John's point about sustaining change, my efforts have become diluted. I've lost my intent and probably back to where I was. So I think that it could be an insight into the challenge that you have when you're saying it's about people changing, and it's not easy.
Okay, if we're to say, look, before we move on, if I were to say, look, at this kind of top level, because we'll go into stuff in more detail later on, at this top level, if there are 3 or 4 reasons maybe that we would see why change programs don't work to the full capacity or to their ambition, what would they be?
I think the first one is maybe that they actually got the goal, whatever they're trying to do to achieve, or the vision is wrong. So that's one of the research would show that if that's wrong, well then everything else that falls out of it is wrong. So you pick the wrong strategy. Secondly, if you don't really communicate it and buy people into it, you really engage them around it. Right. It's not just about putting a PowerPoint together and showing it to staff and say, well, that's it. Because people will hear that and say, yeah, it makes sense. But so people don't fear change as such, but they certainly fear being changed themselves. Yeah. So when they go away then and say, well, how's this going to affect me? Does this mean I could lose my job or change? Then the resistance comes in and the change program begins to fail, and you find people going to the union or whatever it is and objecting to it. And it's back to sustaining it then, inability to sustain it.
I mean, just and what John is saying, I suppose one of the things you constantly see is that people underestimate what it takes to embed change, because they think a management team might think once the analysis is done, that's the main bit done. So why hasn't it happened? In reality, as a chief executive said in a presentation I was at just about a year ago, he said the task of analysis, difficult as it is 100 times easier than the task of implementation. Right. So, and the second mistake I think that management teams make is that once we've decided what needs to change, those people out there need to change. Without thinking, what about me? I mean, what change do they need to see in me to make it credible?
Right. Absolutely. Change comes to the top.
Okay, so if we're saying basically things like the vision needs to be very clear. The next thing, where it's not clear, failure happens. When communications are not there,
it's not compelling enough.
It's not going to happen. Where the leadership is not given
the role modelling.
So those are the sort of things that we're talking about.
A great analogy that I use is the tale of the pioneers going west. It's a story of the pioneers who left the east coast and went to the west coast of the States, and the wagon train. So I won't go into it now, we'll go into it again, but it's a great story to understand how change happens and how people start out on a journey, not bringing all sorts of tools and equipment and skills with them, which are totally unnecessary or not sufficient to meet the challenges of the mountains, of the rivers, of the Indians and everything else. So it's a journey that goes through the West, but shows you that you need a lot of different skills, and probably the flexibility is probably one of the greatest skills of all.
Okay, now in our thinking around this, we've come up with 7 kind of steps, well, not really steps, but 7 elements that are probably going to be necessary to address if you're going to have any chance of having a successful program. So maybe you take us through those.
Yeah, okay, so if I just go through the 7 steps and then we'll make a few general comments on them. Yeah. The first step would be to do a strategic review or do business review of your business. In other words, and to put it simply, what needs to change? So that's the big decision that needs to be made. The second one is to actually design the program to actually implement those decisions, because where a lot of companies fall down is they don't adequately plan. You know, it's the Roy Keane statement: fail to prepare, prepare to fail. The next one would be to start out on the communications or consultation process with staff. So in certain instances, like in a merger or in redundancies, you have a legal obligation to consult with trade unions or with staff. And I think just before that, or as part of that, there is a step of communications. So who are your stakeholders? What is the message you need to deliver to them, and how often do you need to deliver to them? So you have to communicate with your stakeholders. The fifth and sixth steps would be to do with the actual implementation of change. One particular step would be the implementation of staff reduction. Another step would be the implementation of a number of, for instance, of cost-cutting measures that might be non-staff related. And then the seventh step is to build organisational effectiveness into the future. So you go right from the first one, which is to do a review. You design the programme, you plan and manage your communications, you consult, you manage your pay cost reduction, you manage your staff reduction, and then you build effectiveness into the future. And I think the quick point I make about it, Peter, is when I hear myself talking about it like that, it sounds neat and symmetrical and easy, and it's like a formula you do. Yeah. We know in reality that by following a certain process and knowing where you are in the process, it does help you. But the reality of managing it is not neat and symmetrical. You know, it's challenging.
Yeah, and you're saying that these steps, they seem to be in sequence the way you're talking about them here, Mick, but you're saying that it doesn't necessarily happen like that in reality.
No, they're not necessarily in sequence. I mean, you've got to do all of them nearly at one time. You consider them. I mean, people can see we back up questions on the website to support each of the headings.
Oh yeah, just to say that those 7 steps, they're on your website. They're underneath where we're on at the moment, and you can get them at any stage. You go down through those. There's the 7 steps and 57 questions, basically that are decisions that have to be made. Nice and symmetrical, 7 and 57, but they just work out that way. So in dealing with those, not necessarily the first one of those basically is the strategic review, but I've just got a thing in here on our website at the moment. First question has come in: at what stage is it best to tell staff about change? I know that's not what we're talking about here at the moment, but just let's answer the question anyway.
Well, okay, do you want to?
No, go ahead.
Okay, I mean the thing I think about it is staff generally know a lot of what's going on in the business. Staff on the ground are closest to customers. They know if things need to change. So I think you should communicate with staff as well and as often as possible without creating unnecessary